The first sound of winter in the Carter Hollow was the axe. It came up out of the compounding quiet. 3 soft beats against the frozen log, a pause, 3 more, so steady that Eli could set his clock by it, even before he was old enough to tell time. The axe lived in his father's rhythm, the edge finding wood, the grain splitting, the dull sigh as the block settled. Even on mornings when frost rimed the windows and breath hung in the kitchen like a thing you could catch in your hands, Thomas Carter's swing held a calm certainty that made the rest of the cabin feel less brittle. Eli would stand at the small table with a sheet of paper, tracing the lines his father drew. The sketches were not pretty. They were charcoal scrawls, rectangles for panes, a lopsided arc to mark the lean of a frame, short hash marks where Thomas wrote numbers that Eli was learning to read, inches, degrees, the time of day. Those numbers meant something like a promise. If you measured, the cold could be argued with. Eli liked the way his father made heat look like a problem you could map. They had run close to the bone that winter. Wood that used to last the household through bleak months had begun to vanish in fits. Wind-bitten trees lost their bark. Old logs that once burned hot now sizzled into black. Each stove-thinning night made the kitchen smell more strongly of smoke, and the small room of people more of planning. Thomas would sit, pipe in hand, and mark down how much wood had been used that day. 70 feet, he'd say, and the number would sit there in charcoal like a fact you could not argue with. He had always believed that if you watched what the weather did to the house, you could build something to slow it down. The idea came to him like an edge of sense rather than a single bright thought. Thomas started saying, in the way men sometimes do when they are thinking aloud, that maybe the house could be given a skin. Not a stove, he told Eli, pointing at a sketch where squares of glass hugged the cabin, but a shell. Glass around us so the sun can get in, and the cold has to fight through 2 layers before it reaches the wood. He used simple words, skin, shell, buffer, and drew the sun like a child's circle with lines. For Thomas, the logic was steady. Glass stops immediate wind, traps the faint daylight for longer, and if you pile weighty things inside that shell, stones, packed earth, the heat making in the day would seep into them and come out again when the night bit. At first the neighbors chuckled. They called it the fancy glass coat. Caleb Morris, who kept the only real wagon for miles and liked to stand on his porch as if he were the center of an efficient world, whistled at the sketches and said, "You'll roast flies, not people." Others said glass would be useless, glass would crack, glass would make a better grave than a greenhouse. It was, in many of their eyes, an experiment in vanity when the true work was to cut wood until you had none left. Eli learned the language of measurement at his father's elbow. Thomas would give him a thermometer, an old brass thing with a patina and a cracked leather case, and ask him to leave it on the windowsill for an hour. Eli liked watching the mercury slide, a white line like a seam. He would note the time, push his thumb against the chilly back of the case, and in his own ledger, in chalk on the underside of the table, write the small differences. Out, gray frost; in, no frost, few. Thomas laughed and called them few degrees, as if degrees were shy in that place, not numbers to boast about. But to Eli, every degree was a small victory. The night when the kitchen stayed warm enough to melt the edges of butter without adding wood, the morning when frost on the inside pane fogged instead of rhyming solid. They worked slow. There was no money for new glass, and the nearest town was a long day away. The first panes came from a dismantled church window that Thomas bought in trade for a week's labor. The frames had been tossed out years ago by someone who thought them useless. Thomas and Eli dragged the heavy casements across the field, boots slipping on frozen grass. The neighbors watched them coax the frames up the low slope like 2 men hauling a new kind of hope. Putting the first pieces up felt like rehearsing a story. They braced long posts into the ground some distance from the cabin to create a skeleton, then leaned the frames in, one by one, attaching them with borrowed nails and rope. The glass made small, sharp noises, tink, tink, like a chorus of distant bell fragments. On clear days the sun pierced the new enclosure, and the space inside smelled different, like a room that had been closed and reopened. Warmed wood, drier air, dust that was suddenly visible in golden shafts. But nature was a strict tutor. A week after the frames went in, a wind came with teeth. The valley filled with a cold that felt as if it could sort your bones by knuckles. One of the first panes split with a sound that stopped Eli in his tracks. A quick, thin report, glass spattering into jagged leaves. Thomas stood with his hands on his hips, his face a map of careful decisions. He did not show surprise so much as calculation. "Not the end of the thing," he said, almost to himself. He called Eli over and crouched. "See how the crack runs where the frame gave a little? We didn't allow for the swell of the wood when it gets wet." He traced the fracture with a finger, meant only to show direction, not to press. That night they carried the heavier shards into the lean-to, saving the pieces that were whole. For the broken window they stretched canvas, old tent cloth with patched seams, from a barrel vendor in the next county, securing it with tar and rope. It would not be the same as glass, but canvas kept wind from punching into the small gap. It made a soft, muffled sound when the wind struck. Inside the shell the sound was less like a blow and more like a blanket being flapped. Eli learned another lesson that week. When something breaks, you do not throw it away. You make it useful in some other way. They used cracked fragments as smaller panes, set into the lower sections where the frame would not bear so much pressure. They placed stones inside the shell along the sunniest wall, as Thomas suggested. He spoke about mass the way people speak about family, something heavy that could hold heat and give it back. By day the stones would sit warm, and at night they would bleed that warmth slowly, keeping the air close about them less like a blade and more like a hand. The first real measurement came a rainy afternoon when the sun peeked out like an afterthought. Thomas set a thermometer just inside the shell and another on the far side of the cabin, right where the wind punched the corner. Eli sat there with his pencil poised over the charcoal boards. They left them for an hour. When they returned, the numbers had separated, not by a scandalous amount, but enough for Eli to feel his heart do a little beat of pride. The air beneath the glass had fewer ragged breaths. The frost on the outer sill had dulled. "That's the beginning," Thomas said. He did not say it like a prophecy. He said it like someone pointing at a first fence in a long field. It meant there were more fences to build, more seams to seal, more numbers to coax into better shapes. Neighbors kept watching. Some came with help and skepticism in equal parts. Mrs. Harlan brought boiled potatoes and warned about condensation. She'd seen greenhouses rot out from the inside and told them to be careful with moisture. Caleb Morris wandered by, tugging at his collar, and asked whether they had considered vents. "You need a way to let the air turn over," he said, the kind of sentence that carried more experience than malice. Thomas accepted suggestions, wrote them into the charcoaled margins of his sketches, and then tried them. Eli's work was often small but precise. He learned to cut tar paper to the right length so that seams did not pull apart in wind. He learned the weight of nails, how many it took to take the strain of a frame lean. He learned how to sleep in a chair by the stove and wake with half his face numb, then measure 3 thermometers before the sunrise. He kept a ledger, a child's scrawl that grew more assured as the weeks passed. He recorded the placement of stones, the number of layers of canvas, the time of day the fog appeared on the glass. The ledger became his private map of a slow war against weather. Then came the night of the smoke. The stove, which had been fed too little all day as they held the wood for true need, burned down to a low, stubborn heart. Thomas, impatient with the smallness of the fire, lifted the lid of the old wood box and found only scraps. For a moment the room shivered like an animal. Children from 2 houses over, who had been wandering the yards with cold fingers, knocked at the Carter door. Their mother, a woman with a voice that always sounded 2 degrees higher when she was anxious, asked if they could bring someone in when the night settled. Thomas did not hesitate. He opened the door to the canvas shell and beckoned them in. The small space inside the shell was lit by a single lamp and the faint, solid warmth coming from the stones. The newcomers pressed against the makeshift walls and exhaled hard, their breath fogging the panes into a brief, translucent clock. They sat close together, passing a blanket, passing a pot of watered stew warmed on a tiny burner. The shell did what Thomas hoped, at least for that night. It kept the wind off their shoulders and gave the stones time to hold a slow temper. That was the first night Eli saw how the shell worked in the presence of bodies. Heat was not just something forced by stove and flame, it was made of people, too. The collective weight of several breathing chests, of hands clenching mittens, added to the warmth and seemed to slow the drift of cold that always tried to claim the forms of chairs and mugs. Inside, the glass fogged and then cleared as if in acknowledgment. Outside, the night grew harder and took the landscape in white teeth. When the neighbors left, they were quieter than they'd been the week before. Mrs. Harlan, who'd come with the potatoes, patted the stones and said, "You've built a hearth outside the house." Her voice held a new curiosity. Caleb, who had a habit of trying to be the first to know something useful, hid his astonishment under a half-laughed question about the cost of the frames. Thomas only smiled, and Eli felt in that quiet a small widening of space between the man his father was and the man he could be. The shell did not solve every problem. Moisture began to be an issue. Where glass met wood, hushed beads collected. Where canvas overlapped, the seal was never perfect. On colder nights, the panes insisted on frosting at their outer edges. The building was fragile in parts, and when a panel coyly let in a draught, you could hear it like a small animal finding its way into a calm house. Repairs became parts of the rhythm, a metronome of survival. Check seals at dusk, tighten ropes before the wind, replace a cracked pane before another bite took the frame. Eli learned to improvise with what they had. There was a box of broken jars, the tin glass relics collected from roadside trash. He learned to cut them down and set the circular bottoms into the lower sections of the frames to act as mini-solar collectors, little lenses catching the day and letting its warmth slip into the soil below. He carried in earth from the barnyard, mixing it with compost under the south wall where the sun hit hardest. Thomas spoke softly about how roots like a sure, stable place to live, and the soil, warmed through the day, would feed a plant slowly over time. There were arguments which in their house were almost always about the fine edge between hope and stubbornness. Some of the men wanted to cleave more wood, to leave the shell for a less trying season. Others, seeing the fogging glass and stones warmed like stove lids in the morning, began to act as if an alternative was opening. Thomas spent hours talking to anyone who would listen, and even more hours alone in the leaning shed, rubbing his palms together over a mug and sketching variations on the same theme. More frames here, a channel for water there, a vent that could be closed at night. Eli kept close to the ledger. On one page he drew with careful lines a plan for the vent. He had watched Caleb's lips purse at the same suggestion, and then watched Thomas nod and write it down. "Vents let air out, but they also let it in," Thomas told him. "We want to let humidity go and keep warmth where it does the work for us. Too many vents and the shell is no shell at all." They installed a narrow slit near the eaves, covered with a flap of canvas so it could be adjusted. It was a small thing, but it taught Eli to think like a person trying to make the least harm to his own work. On a morning when slush made the road a gray smear and the trees bowed under wet snow, Thomas set 2 thermometers on opposite sides of the cabin and left them for half the day. Eli watched their faces while they did it, the focused calm, the small excitement that looked like someone about to open a present. When they read the difference, Thomas did not claim victory. He folded his hands and said, "It's more steady. Not warm as spring, mind you, but holding us like a good coat." Eli scrawled the numbers and underlined the word steady. That word would return again and again as a quiet measure of their work. One evening, as the dark came early and a wind-built cloud seemed to be filling the valley, they had another setback. A heavy gust struck the shell and forced a frame at an angle. The rope that held the frame to its post snapped with a sound like a small cannon. The pane shattered in a scatter that stung the hands when Thomas collected the larger pieces. They worked long into the night with lantern light to secure the remaining frames. For the gap, they used a double layer of canvas, the inner one held by the tar strips Eli learned to cut while Thomas tended the beam. They doubled the stones against that wall, pressing them together like a line of soldiers. After the repair, there was a silence that smelled of oil and sweat. Eli leaned against a chilled post and looked out through the patched gap. Snow began to come, not the light hiss that dusted the grass, but persistent fat flakes that wetted the ground. The valley grew white as if someone had taken a linen curtain and pulled it across the world. That night the stove was fed with what little remained. Inside the cabin the air warmed for a short while and then cooled again. Outside the wind carried a sense of foreclosing. Many in the hollow had worked through seasons of hard winters, but this one felt thicker, wrapping its hands around the throat of fat stores and reserves. The question that had been humming in the margins came forward like a voice in the dark. If the cold deepened, if the wood failed, would the shell be enough to save more than their own skins? Neighbors began to act differently. Doors that had been left ajar in passing were now fastened. Men walked the field edges at dusk and turned back with faces like carved wood. A woman Eli did not know, thin with hands like winter branches, came to the Carter door and asked if any of them could spare a blanket. She said the road had drifted closed, and for a few nights she had slept in a wagon with a child who had coughs. Thomas gave a blanket without hesitation and then, more quietly, led the woman out to the shell and showed her the place they could sit that would be less cold. He did not promise warmth beyond the immediate. He offered space and timing. An hour there before the wind rose. Eli watched what the shelter did when more bodies came into its enclosed geometry. He watched how the fog on the glass persisted longer and then thinned as people exhaled, moved, marveled. He watched how his father took notes, small, spare lines about who came, where they sat, how long they stayed. He noted, too, the conversations that budded like small green things in the furrows of fear. Caleb came by one dusk and stayed an hour, asking a question about how to set the stones for better heat retention. He did not call it folly after that. There was a moment when the work stopped being only about saving fuel and became about a kind of slow, stubborn possibility. Thomas suggested, on a quiet afternoon, planting something inside the shell. "Not much," he said. "Just a test." His hand traced the same south wall where the stones lay. They dug a small trough and filled it with the warmed leftover compost that had been too coarse for the barnyard. Eli, who had seen seeds coaxed into shoot in jars placed on windowsills, felt his pulse move quickly. He imagined small green stems like fetishes against the frost. They scrawled a plan on a scrap of board. The sunniest side, seeds low, soil warmed with stones and old manure to give the roots a slow heat. They could not plant much. The season was late, and the seeds they had were few and scarcer than the wood. But Thomas thought a red fruit, something bright and impossible in a winter world, would be the best test of their shell's claim. He had talked about tomatoes in the way men discuss adventures they almost dare to believe. "A summer thing in winter would be no miracle," he said, "just careful keeping of what warmth we can find." The very word seemed like a small flame in Eli's mouth. They set the seeds in small wooden boxes, buried them in the trough by the south wall, and covered them with a thin pane of glass to create a further micro-layer. They watered with the tepid water from a kettle heated on the stove and left the boxes to the attention of the day. On clear afternoons, Eli would stand and watch the little bed like a child watching a sleeping animal, waiting for a heartbeat. Thomas would crouch beside him, chalk in hand, adding small notations: time of watering, sunlight length, wind speed described as a folk number, hard, mild, raking. There was a quiet confidence in Thomas, but also a humility. He kept a list of things that could go wrong: too much moisture, a broken pane, roots chilled to the bone. He collected extra pieces of glass in case of breakage, stacking them behind the shed like winter teeth. He told Eli to sleep with the ledger in his pocket on nights when the wind creaked and threatened to snap their work apart. "Record everything," he said. "We'll learn whether the thing is stubborn and useful or whether it needs more care." The valley was not blind to their tests. People passed and iked their curiosity against the shell like a thumb on glass. Some offered tools. Some offered opinions. Some whispered that it would be of no use in a true blizzard. The debate folded into the rhythm of work. The shell was a thing to be argued about at coffee and to be repaired at dusk. As the season leaned toward its worst, the weather took a hard turn. The sky grew heavy and the air felt more like a closing lid. Eli noticed the number of hours they could leave the windows cracked for ventilation without losing the steady hold of the warmth. He noticed, too, that the stones, when warmed in the day, kept the space from falling into a brittle chill at night. The ledger began to show a pattern of small successes and glaring enough failures to keep them humble. One late afternoon, as clouds gathered like a congregation, Thomas stood by the south wall and touched the warmed stones. He looked older in that moment, the lines of his face cut by decisions, and by the marks of splitting wood. Eli wanted to tell him that the shell was a good thing, that his father had done more than keep a house from being cold. He wanted to tell him the way the neighbors had shied into the shell, as if stepping into a small promise. But instead he only pointed to a set of numbers, and Thomas drew his breath out, slow. Outside, the wind began to sound like a hand at a shutter. The valley prepared itself in a way that felt like a held breath. The men returned to their yards early that day, checking ropes, stacking what wood remained, tying down lids and shuttering old wells. On the Carter porch, Thomas tightened the rope that held a corner brace, and then sat for the first time that day, with his arm across Eli's shoulder. "Whatever comes," he said, voice low, "we know what we built. It may not be enough for a storm like the old tales, but it will be enough to tell us how to make it better." The last light went, and for a while the only sounds were the occasional crackle from the stove, the wind moving its hand across the field, and the soft carding of Eli's own breath. They did not yet know, then, that the weather would test what words could not. They did not yet know how hard a night they were walking toward, nor that the thing they had coaxed into being would have to hold more than a man's pride or a child's hope. But as the first heavy flakes began to fall, the shell gleamed like a small island of patience amid an unready sea. Inside, the plants slumbered in their shallow beds, small promises folded into the soil. Outside, the plains whitewashed with intent. Eli closed the ledger that evening and tucked it under his arm as if it were a small shield. He thought of the cracked pane and the canvas patches, of the stones warmed by a timid sun, of Mrs. Harlan's hand on the stone hearth and Caleb's questions. He thought of the seeds, 3 little green hopes set against the world's indifference. He did not yet know how the next days would read in his charcoal margins, but he felt, as clearly as the ache in his knuckles, that they had begun something that could be learned from. If you enjoy stories of quiet invention and the ways people make shelter where there is none, there's another video on screen now that tells a similar tale. The snow began in earnest that night. At first it was a polite thing, a dusting that softened edges. By dawn it had grown bold, fat flakes sticking to posts and hats. The wind came with it like a chorus, and the drifts set themselves up against fences and saplings. Across the hollow, chimneys smoked thin blue, then faded as the supply of wood dwindled. Inside the shell, the fog on the glass became a steady, thin film. The stones breathed out slow warmth. The thermometers did what thermometers do. The mercury held, steadier than it had the week before, not a comfortable warmth, but a buffer that made movement and speech possible. Eli watched the panes, the delicate lattice where frost tried to right itself, but found less purchase. He recorded the time and the subtle shift toward a colder pull outside. Around noon a knock came, tentative and then urgent. A neighboring family, 2 parents and a small boy who swallowed more than his share of worry, stood at the threshold. They had been traveling the road when the wind strangled visibility. Their cart had been stalled, and the drift had closed the lane. Thomas opened the door and did not hesitate. The family passed into the shell, cheeks flushed, hands like small birds. They sat close to the warmed stones and unfolded blankets. Someone held the boy's hands in both of theirs and hummed a hush. For Eli, the sight was a turning point. He had watched the shell on paper and in slow, incremental tests, but seeing it hold people like a retained warmth made something real and immediate. He felt the ledger heavy in his coat. He took the pencil from his pocket and made a quick note. People inside, steady, stones, working. It was hardly poetic, but it was truth. The impression of the day accumulated like the snow. When the storm shifted toward the evening, the wind pressed closer, as if leaning on the house. The shell groaned in small ways, but did not fail. A new crack appeared at the corner where a rope had been frayed. Thomas set to it with the tar and doubled rope, his hands sure despite the cold. They worked together, father and son and neighbor, their breath and the lamplight making the work almost tender. As the sky grew heavy and the world narrowed to a glassy rim, Eli thought of seeds and small green shoots. He thought of how heat could be kept and shared, how stones could hold a day's sunlight under 3 feet of snow. He thought of the ledger and the slow accumulation of degrees, of patience as a physical practice. He did not know yet whether the plants would ever touch a red fruit in such a season, but the possibility was no longer talk. It had become, with hands and tar and rope, a thing that could be tested. The night tightened. Thomas closed the outer flaps, and the shell became a breathing chest against the white. People inside moved slow and quiet, keeping their voices low as if raised tones could crack the night. Eli sat near the south wall where the soil boxes were lined up, his palm flat against the warmed earth. The warmth came not from a blaze, but from a careful arithmetic of stones, compost, human bodies, and sun stolen in the right moments. It felt like an argument in favor of small things. Outside, the storm did what storms do. It remade the plane. But inside, the shell held, not as a miracle, but as an engineered patience. The panels fogged and cleared with human exhalation. The stones breathed out their day. By the time the world beyond the glass had whitened into an almost precise silence, the Carters had more than opinion. They had data, people sheltered, a ledger filled with small promises, and a set of practices that could be repeated. Eli looked up at his father and saw not the man who split wood in 3 offset beats, but a person who had turned measurements into shelter. He wiped the condensation from a small circle of glass and peered to the outside, where the storm erased distance and turned neighbors' houses into sculptures. In the soft lamplight he could just make out shapes moving in the shell, people breathing, someone humming. The slow rotation of living warmed into the slow geometry of survival. There was more to be done, more panels to replace, more stones to scavenge. There would be other nights, some gentler, some hard enough that the tar on their seams would cry and need mending. But for the moment, with the ledger warm against his knee, Eli felt the relief of something begun and the pressure of what must follow. He traced a line on the charcoal sketch, marking a wall for reinforcement, and underlined the word that had become their quiet measure: steady. He could not have guessed then the full reach of what that steadiness would prove. He could not know how people would take the idea and make it their own, how the cracked pane patched with canvas would become a taut solution in other yards. He only knew the immediate fact that in a hollow where wood had become an anxiety and wind had become a measured enemy, a shell of glass and stone and human warmth was holding. The snow outside wrote its cold on the world, and the glass within held a different weather, one made of patient engineering and the sort of care that comes from counting degrees and keeping records. The ledger closed, the lamp burned low, and the thought of small red fruits, bright and almost obscene against the winter, settled in Eli's mind like a promise that required work. He would keep the charcoal and the thermometers and the stones. He would learn the ways heat wanted to hide and how to make it give itself back. For now he listened to the axe's echo in his memory and to the soft sound of people breathing against glass, and he knew that the next mornings would ask more of them. Dawn after the storm came soft and muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in wool. The field outside the shell was a white sweep interrupted only by the crooked fence and the dark angles of tree trunks. Snow clung to posts and dripped from eaves in slow, patient beads. Inside, the air moved differently, heavier, warmer by comparison. The glass was a blurred map of breath and frost. Through a small cleared circle near the south wall, Eli could see the day pale and low, as if the sun had been put there by someone sparing with light. Eli rose before anyone else and felt for the ledger in his coat pocket like a man looking for a compass. He carried it to the south window and set 2 thermometers side by side, one pressed against a pane, the other tucked in the soil box beside the first seedlings. He had learned to trust those small brass things. They did not promise warmth, only truth. When he peeled back the circle of condensation and read the tiny scales, he felt that particular quiet sort of satisfaction that comes from evidence. Inside, the air held firmer against cold. It was not a spring room, nothing luxurious, but where the valley had surrendered to the white, the shell kept a different weather, stitched by glass and stone and human habit. The seedlings, which had been only thin hopes the week before, had edges now. Their leaves were small and lanced, a slightly darker green than Eli had expected. A few had pushed toward tiny yellow flowers, minute things that sat like lanterns among the leaves. He knelt and warmed his palms on the earth, feeling the slow give of soil that had been fed by compost and the day's gathered sunlight. Underneath, Thomas had built a tidy pile of warmed manure and straw, a quiet furnace that gave off a shy heat. The idea of compost heat was not new to the men of the Hollow. Barns hummed with it in spring. But trapped beneath glass and beside stone, it behaved differently, a hidden furnace helping roots keep moving when the world would prefer to stop them. They had chosen seeds with a practical mind, small-fruited varieties that were known to do their work even without much fuss, types that set fruit reliably in enclosed spaces. Many tomatoes are self-pollinating. Each flower contains both the seed and the stir it requires to become fruit, so they did not rely on bees in winter. Still, Eli had learned to mimic what the insects would do. Each morning he would tap the stem of the plants, or give a gentle shake to the trays when he passed, and sometimes he would blow softly across the blossoms, an improvised breeze that coaxed pollen where it needed to go. By week 2, green domes of swelling fruit peeked under the leaves. They were only a thumb's width at first, but they kept their color in a way that surprised Eli, an unripe, promising green that did not brown on the tips. The stones along the south wall, laid like a slow-keeping chest, had gotten warm enough by midday that their heat fed the soil even after the sun dipped. At night the warmed stones exhaled slowly, like a person easing sleep. The lamp in the corner, kept low and shielded, added a modest, steady contribution. Its glass caught and re-radiated a tiny portion of warmth. Human bodies, too, mattered. Neighbors who came into shelter raised the ambient temperature by degrees that mercurial instruments could record and a ledger could show. Not everything bent to their will. One afternoon a heavy gust barged against the shell and found a seam they had thought secure. A frame jarred, a hairline fracture spread, and for a moment Eli's stomach folded inward as if someone had stroked a nerve. They worked by lantern into the dusk, using pieces of broken jars and the smaller scraps of glass they had kept for such mischiefs. These smaller circles and squares were set into frames lower down where wind pressures were less severe. Eli learned to pack tar carefully into a crack so it would not be brittle in a week's frost. He learned to make a rope loop that would take strain instead of the nail. There were nights when their repairs felt like patching a coat that a winter wolf kept leaving teeth in. It was honest work, full of the false comforts of quick fixes and the slow wisdom of better ones. When the storm tightened again 2 days later, bringing the cold deeper and a wind that bit at seams, several families crowded into the shell. The space took in the murmur of voices and the patter of mittens and turned it into a low bass note of survival. Children pressed noses to fogged glass and giggled at the world being turned into a smudge. An old woman hummed hymns under her breath, and the sound made the glass pulse a little like a drum. Thomas moved among them with calm hands, passing around a pot of watered broth that had been heated only enough to take the chill out. He checked the seals, tightened the ropes that tied frames to posts, and after the panic of the day had leached a little, took out his charcoal and wrote 3 new notations. One about vent placement, one about stone mass distribution, and one about the compost's temperature. "You can see it," Caleb said at one point, standing where the fog thinned enough to make his breath a short white. He had come with a length of spare canvas and a roll of twine, the kind of man who once scoffed but now thought in practicalities. He tapped the south wall and felt the steady radiance. "Not summer, not by a long shot, but it's doing work." His voice had the flavor of someone learning humility. The ledger grew thick with small entries, times of day when the panes fogged, hours when the stones were warmest, the count of people sheltered, and the curious correlation between number of breathing bodies and degree hold in the room. Eli's handwriting had tightened. He made neat little graphs with charcoal marks and sketched a new fitting for a vent that could be slotted with a flap to let steam out on bright afternoons and kept closed at night. Thomas taught him to think like a person who keeps score with the world rather than talk to it. "We want the heat to move through things that can save it," he said once, pressing his palm into the warmed stone. "Air is too quick. The heavy things remember." It was inevitable that word would spread. Men from 2 hollows over came in the thaw between storms to look at the frames and to ask questions that were all the more pointed because they carried the weight of practical need. Some of them brought crates of extra stone, others offered old windows salvaged from terrace houses. Over time, people adapted the original shell to their needs. Some built lower, sturdier frames to protect livestock, Others made smaller, portable boxes that would sit by stable doors. The method was not perfect for everyone. A few attempts failed when frames were put up without proper bracing or when composts were allowed to rot rather than gently smolder. But where people took care and measured as the Carters did, the enclosure frequently brought comfort and occasionally crops. The decisive night came not with a single trumpet, but with the slow accumulation of conditions arranged by patience. A long, high snow had returned, and wind drove against the valley in sheets that obscured the horizon. Inside the shell, the fog on the panes had become a film that cleared in circles where someone's hand had rubbed it. The tomato plants, which had been patient and stubborn in equal amounts, now bore several small fruits, rounded green shapes that sat like promise beneath leaves ribbed with veins. Eli checked them with a reverent impatience. Each fruit had a faint sheen, a skin that caught the lamp and seemed to hold it. He cupped one in his hands and felt an almost imperceptible warmth, like the beating of life itself. It was not a miracle. It was a plausible quiet, captured sunlight that had warmed stones and soil, the slow combustion of compost beneath the trays, the low, steady lamp, the shared body heat of people who came to shelter and left and returned, and the careful sealing that kept draught at bay. All those elements added up to a small, sustained difference in the microclimate inside the shell, degrees that meant the difference between a plant finishing the slow chemistry that ripens a fruit and a plant that simply sits and waits for a summer that would not come. Late in the afternoon, when the storm tore at the valley and whiteness climbed the windows like rising tide, Eli noticed the first hint of red through the lattice of leaves. It was not a flash. It was a modest, deepening color, as if someone had taken a thread of sunset and bound it slowly into the skin of the fruit. He called Thomas, who had been tightening a rope on an outer brace. They watched in a silence that felt like a ceremony. Thomas's face, lined and steady, allowed a small, private smile. He did not make a grand speech because the moment did not invite one. Instead, he reached for a small knife, wiped its blade on his coat, and cut the stem close to the fruit. When the tomato came free, it let out a faint steam where its warm flesh met the colder air of the shell. The sound was like a tiny sigh. Eli held it, and the color seemed almost obscene against the world beyond the glass, a bright, unapologetic red, framed by white and gray. The smell was sudden and emphatic. Tomato warmth and green leaves and the faint tang of compost and the human scent of hands that had tended it. Thomas split the fruit between them with the slow care of men who know that some things are better in halves. The flesh inside was yielding and hot to the tongue, the seeds like small pockets of quickness. They ate in a small, shared astonishment, and outside the storm pressed on as if unfazed, while inside the shell the taste of sun in winter rolled across their mouths. Neighbors who crowded near the south wall watched and could not help but laugh, half disbelief and half joy. A child wiped her hand on the hem of her dress and pressed a cheek to the glass, drawing a fogged circle with a small palm. Mrs. Harlan, whose caution had once been sharper than most, pressed a palm to the warm stone and nodded. The tomato was proof, but more than proof. It was a mapping of what careful practice could do in small climates. People began to speak differently about the shell after that day. Skepticism loosened into curiosity and then into adaptation. Some took cuttings, others took seeds. Caleb, who had come begrudgingly at first, carried a wrapped pane of glass back to his own yard and set about bracing his posts with the learned steadiness of a man who had seen a thing work. The real work came afterward. The Carters did not declare victory and set down their tools. Instead, they revised designs. Thomas spent hours measuring how far the heat of the stones reached into the soil and calculated where to place compost trenches to maximize the slow release. Eli learned to line the lower frames with a second layer of broken jars, creating a crude double glazing that trapped more air and slowed the passage of cold. They taught neighbors to put vents at the right height to prevent mildew and to insulate at night with canvas flaps stuffed with straw. Some solutions were modest: a turned-over barrel to protect a lower frame, a flap of tar paper to stop a persistent draft. Others were larger projects, community workshops where men learned to fit frames so that the glass would take stress more evenly, where women taught each other how to water less and mulch more to keep roots from chilling. Eli grew into his role like a person finding a voice that matched his hands. He began to speak at gatherings, but his teaching was never showy. He brought his ledger and his charcoal sketches and set them on a crate while people watched. He would trace a line, where the south light threw most warmth, how stones should be stacked to avoid cracking, and he would let the quiet numbers do the convincing. Young men who had once mocked his father's drawings sat with their sleeves rolled and counted knots in ropes. Women who had shared the early worries taught others how to nurse a weak plant through a cold snap. The idea spread not because it promised miracles, but because it promised measured gains, fewer nights with raw cold, a place to shelter someone whose cart had been stranded, the possibility of a red fruit to cut into in a month when the world beyond the glass was white. There were losses. Not every shell survived every storm. Some frames, rushed or poorly anchored, failed in a high wind. Some compost piles went sour when too wet. Some neighbors, in a season of desperate need, used pieces of glass for other repairs and left their enclosures bare. The story that people told in the years to come always included those failures as much as the success. That was part of why the method endured. It was continually revised to handle what it had not yet seen. Thomas and Eli kept records of failures with the same care as of successes, noting where a seam had opened and how many nights a makeshift vent had been left ajar. They taught prudent redundancy, keep spare panes, stash extra rope, have a roll of canvas in the barn. Time in its turn did what the ledger could not. Seasons rolled and the hollow changed from a place where wood went fast to a patchwork of glass-lit yards. The shell became less an eccentricity and more an element of everyday life. People built them differently, some as permanent glass houses with low beds for seedlings in spring, some as simple screened verandas that would shelter a family or a cow through a sudden freeze. The method traveled with some who left the valley looking for work. They carried panes and rope and the story of a tomato into other places where it was adapted and altered. Years accumulated on Thomas's face and on the shell itself. The original frames picked up scars, an old crack patched with smaller shards, a corner reinforced with an extra post, canvas flaps that had been sewn and mended so often their patches had a history of stitches. Thomas slowed in his swing with the axe, but he did not stop coming out to check the ropes or to press a palm to the weighted stones. Eli, who had once held the ledger like a charm, now read notations in other people's hands and taught the finer points of bracing and compost tending. He took trips to neighboring hollows to help fit frames and left behind sketches on scrap wood so others could follow the pattern. The most ordinary proof of change was not in any single house, but in the valley's light. On cold evenings when the sun fell early and the dark widened like a mouth, small islands of glass glowed one after another along the low ridge, panes catching lamps, the warm yellow of kitchens spilling onto snow, the silhouette of someone moving within. Children ran between those lights as if moving from one story to another, fearless because they had places to go that were not all wind and cold. People met on paths that would once have been forbidding and shared seeds and stories and small tools. The idea that had begun as a stubborn experiment had become a practical, imperfect part of how a community met winter. The tomato would remain the story's favored emblem, one bright red proof pinned to the memory of a long white winter. When people told it later, they rarely spoke of it as a miracle. They told instead of the circumstances, the stones, the compost, the lamp, the sealed vents, the patient tending, and how those pieces could be put together again. Eli would sometimes listen to a retelling and think less of the fruit itself than of that cool, steady moment when he and his father had shared it, when the world beyond the glass insisted on its sameness, and inside there was the warmth of hands and the taste of summer saved in a winter pocket. Decades later, when Eli's hair threaded with gray and the rhythm of an axe had become more a memory than a companion, he stood at the edge of the field and watched the valley. Younger men and women had taken the idea and bent it to their own ends. Some had built larger, more refined structures that used far more glass, while others kept the thriftier models that could be raised by a pair of hands in a day. Children ran past with jars and seed trays in their arms, their voices bright. The original shell, once patched and repatched, still held its place behind the Carter house. Its glass was scored, its frames bore extra nails and rope. Yet when the late sun touched the south wall, steam rose in soft columns, and a small garden of winter crops glowed inside. Eli touched the ledger now less often than he used to, but he still kept a small page of numbers and sketches tucked into a pocket. He taught with the quiet patience his father had given him. He explained when asked that the success of a winter garden came from layering defenses, the sun's light stored in stone, held by glass, the hidden heat of compost, lids and vents used with sense, the warmth of human bodies, and perhaps most important, the willingness to measure and to mend. "We do not fight the weather so much as give it more to work on," he would say, pointing to a cross-section of the south wall and tracing where stones lay like a slow bank. People around him would nod, already knowing the truth of it from their own patched frames. On a late afternoon, not unlike the one when they had first tasted the winter fruit, Eli watched a small boy pick a tomato from a low bed inside a neighbor's shell. The snow lay soft and even in the yard beyond. The house lights were on like small hearths. The boy bit into the tomato, and not a single person nearby pretended it was anything but a plain human joy. Eli smiled, thinking of how everything worth keeping required tending and repair. He thought of his father's steady swing and of the ledger's small, honest language of degrees and draws and days. The valley had not been made over by invention alone. It had been remade by people who took the slow work of learning and shared it. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing and passing it along. There are more quiet tales of practical invention that show how small changes make space in a harsh world.